or a shelter bed in Cincinnati costs nothing on paper. The actual cost is a curfew at 7 p.m., a bag search every time you walk in, a locker that doesn't lock, and a room with 34 other people where the light stays on all night. Delia Marsh paid that price for 4 months. Then she found a garden shed at the back of an empty lot on Fenwick Street and stopped paying it. She was 21 when she first stood in front of that shed. The padlock on the door had been cut and left hanging, still threaded through the latch but not holding anything together. The door was warped at the bottom from water. The whole structure leaned maybe 2 degrees to the left, barely enough to notice until you looked at the roofline against the sky. She stood there for a few minutes, then she went inside. What she found was 8 feet by 10 feet of unpainted plywood walls, a concrete floor, one small fixed window on the south side caked with dirt, and a corrugated metal roof with a 6-inch gap at the peak where 2 panels had shifted apart. There was a plastic lawn chair missing, one armrest, and a metal shelf unit with 2 shelves bolted to the back wall. That was everything. She did not fix the gap in the roof that night. She did not fix it the next night either. She slept in the plastic chair with her bag in her lap and her jacket zipped up and pinned shut at the collar. And she listened to the neighborhood quiet down around midnight, and then start up again around 4 in the morning when the delivery trucks began moving through the industrial side of the block. It was November. Delia grew up in Price Hill, on the west side of Cincinnati. Her mother worked dispatch for a courier company for 11 years, and then the company restructured, and the job was gone about 5 months after that. And by the time Delia was 19, the situation had already been unraveling for long enough that there was no single moment she could point to as the start of it. It came apart the way things do when they come apart slowly, gradually, then faster, then all at once. She couch surfed through most of 19. Friends from high school, an aunt in Norwood for 6 weeks, a guy she'd worked with at a sandwich shop who let her stay in his spare room until his girlfriend moved in, and that arrangement became untenable. At 20, she landed at the shelter on Central Parkway. She stayed there long enough to understand exactly what the shelter could and could not do for her. What it could do, give her a place to sleep that was indoors, a locker, access to a shared bathroom, one hot meal in the evening. What it could not do, give her a key. Give her a door that was hers. Give her a space where she could leave her things and trust they'd be there. Give her quiet, give her a way to come and go on her own schedule, which mattered more than she could have explained to someone who'd never lost that. The curfew was the part that broke everything. She'd found a cashier position at a grocery on Vine Street, evening shifts, which were the shifts available, which meant she finished at 9 p.m. and couldn't get back to the shelter before a lockout, twice, and slept in a laundromat on Western Avenue. She missed it a 3rd time, and they gave her bed away. She was 20 years and 4 months old and standing outside a shelter with a duffel bag and $47 in her pocket. She found a spot under the 6th Street Viaduct for 3 nights. Then a woman named Carla, who ran an outreach program through a church, on 8th, connected her with a transitional housing list and put her name down. The wait was 14 months. Delia Marsh did not wait 14 months. She found the shed in the 2nd week of November, 6 days after she lost the shelter spot. She'd been walking the neighborhoods east of downtown, the ones that run into each other without clear edges, Pendleton bleeding into Walnut Hills into the stretch where residential lots start coming apart at the corners and empty properties outnumber occupied ones. Fenwick Street was one of those streets. The corner lot had been a house once. The foundation was still there, a concrete rectangle with broken block walls coming up maybe 2 feet. The house itself was gone, cleared down to the slab at some point. The shed at the back of the lot was original, older than whatever house had stood there, sided in tone. One that had gone gray and soft at the bottom where it sat close to the grade. She went back 3 times before she went inside. Once in daylight, once at dusk, once after midnight. She was watching to see if anyone else was using it, if there were lights in the adjacent houses that suggested active neighbors paying attention to the lot, if there were signs the property was being managed. There were none. The adjacent house on the east side had plywood over the windows. The one on the west was occupied, but its backyard faced away. The shed was at the far corner of the lot, maybe 90 feet from the street, behind a line of overgrown arbor vitae that had been a hedge once and was now a wall. She did not go in impulsively. She thought about it for 6 days. That's a thing people get wrong about being in that situation. They imagine decisions get made fast out of desperation. Some do. But Delia had been sleeping in a laundromat for 3 nights with people coming in and out at all hours, and what she felt when she found the shed was not desperation. It was closer to recognition, like she was looking at something that had been sitting there waiting. She went in. She sat in the plastic lawn chair. She stayed. The first problem was the gap in the roof. It wasn't a leak problem exactly, not yet, because November in Cincinnati had been dry, but cold air poured through it at night like it had somewhere to be. She could feel the draft from the chair. She could see the strip of dark sky through it when she looked up, and on the clearest nights she could see 1 or 2 stars in that strip, which was a strange and specific kind of uncomfortable, the outside being visible from the inside in a place that's supposed to be the inside. She could not spend money she didn't have on materials. She was still working at the grocery on Vine. The evening shift paid $13.40 an hour. After the shift, she took a bus partway and walked the rest. She had no phone bill, no rent, no utilities, which sounds like freedom until you understand that it also means no way to stay warm reliably and no address to put on paperwork when paperwork comes up. She started with what was on the lot. Behind the shed, against the back fence, there was a tarp folded up and weighted down by a section of concrete block, still usable. She pulled it out and stretched it over the roof, folding the excess down over the sides and holding it in place. With the concrete block sections, she walked back and forth from the fence. The tarp wasn't waterproof anymore. It was old enough that the coating had started to crack in the folds, but it cut the wind through the peak gap by most. She could feel the difference that first night. Not warm, just less cold. Where she found a scrap of rigid foam insulation, the pink kind, about 2 feet by 3 feet, in the debris near the foundation. It had been outside long enough to be dirty, but not long enough to be degraded. She brought it inside and laid it on the concrete floor and stood on it while she got ready in the morning, and stood on it while she put her shoes on at night. A concrete floor in November pulls heat out of your feet faster than almost anything. One piece of foam against a concrete slab is not insulation, but it's the difference between one surface that's not concrete and no surfaces that aren't. That's how the first 2 weeks went. Not building something, just closing gaps. The question of the lock took longer than she expected. The existing padlock was cut, the hasp still attached to the door, the latch it connected to still on the frame. She needed a way to secure the door from inside at night, and a way to secure it from outside when she left. She couldn't put a new padlock on from outside without drawing attention to the fact that the shed was now occupied. She couldn't leave it unsecured. What she did, she bought a barrel bolt from a hardware store on Reading Road for $4.19 and installed it on the inside of the door, near the top. With screws she had to ask the clerk to help her select because she didn't know the right length for tone. 1-1. The bolt let her lock herself in at night. From the outside when she left, she wedged a scrap of 2x4 between the door and the frame at an angle, tight enough that the door looked stuck, not secured, which was a different signal. It was not a real lock. It would not stop anyone who wanted in, but it looked like neglect rather than occupancy, and that distinction mattered more than the security. She slept better after the bolt was installed, not because she was safer, because the door made a specific sound when it was fully closed and bolted that she'd calibrated to, a small click and a settling, and once she heard that sound, she could stop listening for the door. December came faster than she was ready for. Cincinnati gets a specific kind of cold in December that isn't about the temperature exactly. It's wet cold, the kind that sits in the air and doesn't move, the kind that gets into damp wood and concrete and anything else that's been outside too long. The shed was all of those things. The tone, 1-1 siding, had soft spots along the bottom edge from years of ground contact. The concrete floor held cold like a battery holds charge. The single window on the south side was single pane, original, and the putty around the glass had gone brittle and pulled away from the frame in places. She was spending every shift at work in wet shoes because her boots had a crack along the left welt that opened when the sole flexed and let water in. She could not afford new boots. She found a pair of men's work boots at a church thrift sale on Coleraine Avenue for $6, 2 sizes too big, and stuffed the toes with grocery bags, and wore 2 pairs of socks. They were not good boots. They were dry. The grocery shift ended at 9 and she got to the shed somewhere between 10 and 10:30 depending on the bus. She had a small headlamp she'd found in a donation box at the church outreach. Still worked, needed AA batteries every few weeks. She kept her things in her duffel, organized by what she needed access to at night versus what could stay buried. Toothbrush, headlamp, the bolt, a change of socks, Those were top layer. Everything else went under. Or she was eating one meal a shift at the grocery because employees could eat during breaks, and she was timing her break for when she was hungriest. She was drinking water from the employee bathroom sink. She was making it. But December was the first time she thought seriously about insulation, not as a concept, as a project, something she'd have to plan and source and do herself, with her hands, in the time she had between shifts. Here is what she knew about insulation before she started. Almost nothing. What she knew about heat, that it moved toward cold, that stopping it from moving was the point, that there were different materials for this, and some of them were cheap and some of them weren't. She used the library branch on Glenway. She had a library card from before, still valid. She sat at one of the computers for 90 minutes on a Wednesday when she had no shift, and she read everything she could find about DIY shed insulation, about vapor barriers, about what you could use if you couldn't afford fiberglass bats or spray foam. She wasn't looking for perfect. She was looking for good enough. What she came back to, rigid foam board. It was the cheapest per R value option at the hardware store she could walk to. It didn't need a vapor barrier on its own the way fiberglass did. It was easy to cut with a utility knife. And it could be installed without mechanical fasteners if you used construction adhesive, which she could not afford, or spray foam gaps and cracks, which was $6 a can and did double duty as adhesive and air seal. She also read about something called a radiant barrier, basically reflective foil that bounces heat back into the room rather than letting it escape. Cheap versions exist. The cheapest version is emergency Mylar blankets, the ones that are sold for camping and emergencies. $1 each at dollar stores. A reflective layer on the inside of the wall would not replace insulation, but it would help what insulation she had work better. She made a list. She did not buy everything at once. The first piece of rigid foam board went up in January, 4 to 6 weeks after she moved in. She bought it, one sheet at a time, 2-inch thick, from a building supply store on Spring Grove Avenue that sold individual sheets. A 4x8 sheet cost $22. She bought one every 2 or 3 weeks when the shift money allowed. She cut each sheet on the ground outside the shed, scoring and snapping it with a straight edge she borrowed from the outreach center and never quite returned. She fit each piece against the wall, trimmed it until the gaps were small, and then ran a bead of the $6 foam around the edges to hold it and seal the cracks. The walls took 3 months. She did one wall at a time, starting with the north wall because that was the direction from which January was arriving. While she was doing the walls, she started on the floor. The floor was concrete over bare ground, and it was the biggest single heat drain in the space. She couldn't pour a new floor. She could layer over it. She found a pallet behind a restaurant supply store on Mitchell that they were throwing away, broke it down into individual boards, and used the boards to build a simple platform, not a real subfloor, just a grid of boards that got her up off the concrete. Then she bought one more sheet of rigid foam and cut it into pieces to lay on top of the boards. Then she found an area rug, maybe 4 feet by 6, at an estate sale for $3 and laid it on top of the foam. The first night after the rug went down, she stood on it in her socks and felt the difference in her feet, before she even had time to think about it. She will tell you the shed never got warm. Not warm the way a house is warm. Not warm the way a room with a functioning furnace is warm. That's the thing she's clear about. What it got was warmer than outside, warmer than the viaduct, warmer than the laundromat, warmer than 34 people in a room with a light that stays on. By February, she could sleep without her jacket on. By March, the temperature inside at night was running 10 to 15 degrees above the outdoor temperature without any heat source. That's what insulation does. It doesn't generate heat, it just holds whatever heat you put in. Her body was the heat source. The insulation was keeping her body heat in the room. She had no electricity. She would not run an extension cord from anywhere. That was a line she thought about and didn't cross. The risk of fire from an extension cord running across a lot, the visibility of the cord, the fact that it would be taking something that wasn't hers, those things mattered to her in a specific order she never quite explained but felt clearly. She had the headlamp, she had candles she burned carefully, never near the foam insulation, always on the metal shelf in a glass holder. The candle put out almost no heat, but the light it threw was warm-toned in a way the headlamp wasn't. And there is something about candlelight in a small space in winter that she found she couldn't really account for, except to say it helped. Their spring changed things. She'd made it through one winter. The shed was still standing, the lot was still vacant. She had not been found out. The adjacent neighbors had apparently decided that the shed's door, being sometimes different than they remembered it being, was not their problem, or they hadn't noticed, or they didn't care. Cincinnati has a lot of empty lots with structures on them that nobody is actively watching. Fenwick Street had enough of its own concerns. In the spring, she started thinking about water. Their shed had no running water. She had been managing with the grocery bathroom and the library bathroom, and a 2.5-gallon jug she filled at the library sink and carried back on the bus. 2.5 gallons is not a lot of water. It covers drinking and the minimum of hygiene. It does not cover laundry or anything more than that. She had been doing laundry at the laundromat on Western $2.75 a load, once a week, the minimum she could manage on a cashier's wage. What she added in spring, a 7-gallon water container from a camping supply store, the kind with a spigot that she could keep on the shelf and fill twice a week. She added a small plastic basin she found at a Goodwill for $1.50, which she used for washing up. She added a battery-operated clip fan for air circulation as the temperature started climbing, because a well-insulated space in summer is the reverse of what you want, without ventilation. She fixed the window. The window on the south side had been painted shut at some point, and the putty around it had pulled away. She cleaned the glass, scraped the paint from the frame edge, and opened it for the first time. It stuck halfway, and she left it there. That 4-inch gap changed everything about the air in the shed when the weather was above 50 outside. Enough cross-ventilation to make the space feel less sealed, enough light during the day to work in without the headlamp. The shed in spring smelled like old wood and whatever she'd brought in from outside. The shed with the window open smelled like the neighborhood. She hadn't realized until that moment how completely sealed off she'd been all winter, breathing the same air in the same 8x10 space for months. The smell of outside coming in, the sounds of the block, the quality of afternoon light hitting the south wall. Those things hit her differently than she expected. She was 22 by then. She'd been living in the shed for 6 months. She had not told anyone, not Carla from the outreach, not her coworker Tasha at the grocery, who she'd gotten close to, and who would sometimes bring her coffee from the break room unprompted, not the woman at the library desk who knew her by name. She was not ashamed of it exactly. It was more that telling someone would make it something other than what it was, which was a situation she had under control. The transitional housing list she was on had moved. She was no longer 14 months out, she was 9 months out, according to Carla, who she'd stayed in contact with through the outreach program's phone check-ins. 9 months was not 9 months. It was an estimate. It was a number that could become 11 or 12 if funding shifted or a unit didn't open. She stayed on the list. She kept the shed, what she built over summer. She bought a second shelf unit from a thrift store, metal, like the original, and used it to organize. She had a section for food, a section for supplies, a section for clothing folded flat. She bought a tension rod and hung it between the 2 shelf units and used it for hanging items. She bought a small battery-powered LED strip light for inside, $11 at a $1 plus store, which she ran on rechargeable batteries she charged at the library. She built a small step outside the door from 2 stacked concrete blocks that let her step up and in without bending at the frame, which had been something she'd been banging her head on in the dark for months. She put a doormat outside the door, a rubber one also from the $1 plus store. She was aware of how this looked, a doormat outside a shed on a vacant lot. She put it there anyway. It kept mud off the floor. It also made the space feel, to her, like a place someone had chosen on purpose. She was not romanticizing it. She knew what it was. But she'd made it through a winter, and she was still working, and she'd done it without anyone's help, and without money she didn't have, and without taking on debt, and without compromising anything she'd been unwilling to compromise. That was something. She didn't say it out loud, because saying it out loud was not something she did, but she felt it clearly enough that it had a shape. Summer in the shed was harder than winter in a specific way she hadn't anticipated. The insulation worked in both directions. It held heat in winter. It held heat in summer, which is the reverse of what you want. The roof was metal, which meant the sun hit it, and the metal heated and the heat came through the roof and into the space all afternoon. She'd insulated the walls but not the ceiling, and the ceiling was where summer arrived. She bought one more sheet of rigid foam and cut it to fit the ceiling panels, gluing it with the foam cans. It helped. The clip fan helped more. She found a second fan at the thrift store on Coleraine, a small box fan, and positioned it in the open window, pulling air through. The shed in summer, with both fans running and the window open, was not cool, but it was moving air. Moving air in a small space on a hot night is the difference between sleeping and not sleeping. She also started keeping her water jug in a specific corner that stayed shaded all day, which kept it cooler than ambient. She learned which hours the sun hit the south window and started closing it from noon to around 4 to keep direct sun off the interior. She was managing the space like someone who understood its physics, not because she'd studied the physics, but because she'd been in it long enough to feel every angle. The second winter, she was ready in a way the first winter hadn't allowed. She'd added a third layer to the floor, a foam camping mat on top of the rug, something she used at night and rolled up during the day. She'd sealed the remaining gaps in the wall insulation with a second can of foam. She'd taken the tarp off the roof, which had been degrading for a year, and replaced it with 2 overlapping tarps she found in better shape at an estate sale, weighted properly so they couldn't lift in wind. She'd also done something for the ceiling that she was proud of. After the Mylar emergency blankets she'd read about in the library, she'd bought 12 of them over the course of summer at $1.29 each, and stapled them to the foam board ceiling panels, reflective side down. A radiant barrier facing down in winter reflects the body heat back into the room, rather than letting it escape into the foam above. It doesn't eliminate heat loss, but it adds to what the foam is already doing, and together they add up to something real. The second winter, the shed was warmer than the first by a margin she could actually measure. She kept a small thermometer inside, one of the cheap dial ones from a hardware store, and by January the interior temperature at night was consistently 20 to 25 degrees above the outdoor temperature. In a cold snap, when it hit 18 outside, it was 40 inside. Not comfortable, not dangerous. She slept in the camping mat, zipped into a 20-degree bag she'd bought at a steep discount from an outfitter that was clearing inventory, and she wore a wool base layer she'd gotten at the Goodwill on Oakley. The bag cost $47. It was the single largest expenditure she made on the shed in 2 years. She was in the shed for 23 months. The transitional housing unit came up in October of the second year. Carla called the grocery. Delia had used the store as a message number on a Tuesday afternoon during Delia's shift. The unit was in Westwood, 1 bedroom, on a program that covered 70% of rent for 12 months, while she built savings. She had a meeting scheduled for Thursday. She finished her shift. She took the bus home, which is what she'd started calling it, home. She sat in the plastic chair that had been there when she arrived, the one with the missing armrest, and she looked at what she'd built over 2 winters and 1 summer and part of another. Both shelf units organized, the tension rod with 4 items hanging on it, the LED strip on 1 wall, the foam and rug and mat floor, the Mylar ceiling, the barrel bolt on the inside of the doormat outside, the thermometer on the wall by the window reading 58 degrees on an October evening. She had a shift the next morning. She slept in the bag, on the mat, under the Mylar, in the shed. The Thursday meeting went fine. She took the unit in Westwood. She moved in with the duffel bag, which had been her entire moving situation for 3 years, and 3 boxes of things she'd accumulated in the shed that she hadn't had room to carry when she was moving through friends' floors, and the laundromat and the viaduct. She did not tell the Westwood housing program about the shed. She told Carla eventually, because Carla had been consistent with her for 2.5 years and had never once made her feel like a case file. Carla's response was to ask, specifically, how she'd insulated it, which was the right question. Delia walked her through it. She did not go back to Fenwick Street. She thought about going back once, in December of her first month in the apartment, when it got cold and she wanted to see whether the tarps had held through an early snow. She didn't go. It wasn't hers anymore in a way she couldn't fully explain. Not legally. It had never been legally hers, but in a different way, the one that mattered. There are things the shed could do and things it could not do. It could be weather-tight with enough work. It could hold temperature better than bare concrete under a bridge, or the inside of a laundromat at 3 in the morning. It could be organized, functional, safe enough to sleep in, and functional enough to work out of. It could be a place with a bolt on the door and a mat outside it, and a light you could turn on and a specific sound it made when it was closed and locked. It could not be legal. It could not be insured. It could not be an address on a piece of paperwork, which meant it could not connect to anything that required an address, a bank account, a consistent mail location, a reference on a job application. It could not protect her from a property owner who decided to use the lot. It could not give her back the 2 winters the hard way. Delia Marsh was 23 when she moved into the apartment in Westwood. She had $1,240 saved, the most money she'd had in her possession at one time in her adult life. She had a job still, at the same grocery on Vine Street. She had a key that unlocked a door that was hers. She kept the barrel bolt. She installed it on the inside of the apartment door herself, with a screwdriver on the first night. The landlord had not asked her to remove the original lock. She added the bolt to it. It made a small click when it closed. She slept that first night in the apartment the way she'd slept in the shed for 23 months. Quickly, completely, without the particular alertness that comes from not having a door that's yours. The difference was that in the apartment she woke up and the ceiling was painted drywall, not mylar over foam, and the floor was linoleum, not 3-layered materials over concrete, and the light coming through the window in the morning was through a window she could open all the way. She opened it all the way.